I had to stop the stream and start it again.
Why?
Because I had to restart OBS. It worked for the audio. And I guess, in fact, while we're... Let's do one more audio check because I restarted. I'm going to do a local audio check here. Test, test, 1, 2, 3, Nima.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay, playing it back. Check here. Test, test, 1, 2, 3, Nima.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3.
Perfect. And then can you, again, check YouTube and see how our audio is streaming? Testing, testing, Nima, Nima, testing, Nima. Testing, testing, Nima, Nima, testing, Nima. Testing, testing, Nima, Nima. How do we sound? How do we sound? Good?
I see the logo in the background now.
Good.
Yeah, that should always be there before we start, actually.
Oh, I always put it there.
No, it wasn't in the earlier stream.
It says no more Nima ASMR, please. What's ASMR? What's ASMR, Jesus? When you say the background, do you mean the little logo or the big one before the beginning of the show?
The big one.
Okay, well, I mean, what I've been doing is we chat, and then before we start, I switch it over, hit record, and then go.
What was that?
So what I've been doing up until now is before we actually officially hit the record button, I switch it back over to the starting soon, so when we upload the actual recording, then it starts with the starting soon logo.
Right, but couldn't we have that background before we start the whole time? So it doesn't see us like...
So it doesn't see us goofing off?
Yeah.
Yes, I guess we could now because up until now I have been playing a little bit with making sure everything's working in the right spot. But yes. Apparently no more ASMR means...
Autonomous sensory meridian response is a tingling sensation that usually begins on the scalp and moves down the back of the neck and upper spine, a pleasant form of paresthesia. It has been compared with auditory tactile synesthesia and may overlap with frisson.
I think Jesus, well, I know Jesus, he's saying the sound of you eating.
Okay.
Okay, I'm ready.
It's true, people do that.
Say when, Nima.
When?
And here we go.
We'll do it live. Okay. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live.
Hello, this is Dylan Moore and Nima Major of Irida TV coming to you today. It is Wednesday, January, it's 11th, isn't it? It's January 11th, 111. And we are going to be discussing today some economics, some MMT, everybody's favorite, and more specifically, why the gold standard sucks. Hopefully we managed to offend at least somebody out there because I know the gold standard is supposedly seen as this, divine source of sound money that protects us from the predations of the Illuminati overlords. Overlords. I meant to say overlord and inflation. Illuminati overlords inflation tactics. But we're going to make the argument today that it is totally not the case, and that if you understand actual money, how money works, meaning you don't accept the barter theory of money as the source of money, then you're able to make a much more coherent and maybe safe prediction and recommendation for what the a society should be doing with its money. And I was prompted to talk about this. I mean, first of all, because we always want to talk about stuff like that. But specifically, I have been reading Dr. E. Michael Jones' book, Barren Metal. This 1,300-page monstrosity. Let me turn this way. Looks like I only have a full-length novel left to read out of this sucker, so I guess I'm getting pretty close to being done. But he's got a chapter in here called The Crime of 73, and he's referring specifically to 1873 in he's referring to specifically 1873 in the United States. And he goes over that this is the time when, right after the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln expanded the money supply and printed greenbacks, that the Republican Party, now that it was in control, although it did a great job unifying the country and getting rid of slavery, was also, in quotes, very fiscally responsible and pushed the gold standard to the benefit of usurers or people who lend out money. And what he goes over in here is just like on freaking point with everything that we've been talking about when it comes to MMT and economics on this show. So I just wanted to go over it because, I mean, just this first sentence hopefully turns some hairs on some Austrian and libertarian-oriented economists. Hit that button. He says, first sentence at the beginning of this chapter, the biggest threat to what the usurer class referred to as sound money was war. You got that, Nima? The biggest threat to the gold standard was war. And this is very...
Yeah, well, because they would always suspend it.
Yeah.
War.
Under normal circumstances, economies yoked to the gold standard would plod along at a fraction of their productive capacity. Ooh, that's an interesting term that we use often. Because the usurer class, which controlled the political oversight of the economy, continued to benefit from chronic deflation at the expense of labor. Oh, that's also a very interesting thing, Nima. I thought deflation was always good and inflation was always bad. Isn't that the talking points that always come out from the libertarian side or even just the general conservative side?
Right.
Inflation, always bad.
Yeah, it depends on... I mean, I don't know if that's a fair representation of all the Austrians' arguments, but they tend to think that deflation is good, yeah, and inflation is always bad. But it depends on what's the cause of the inflation, right? And also, it depends on what your definition. So here we already have a problem, right? The Austrians, they just say if the money supply goes up, it's inflation, and if it goes down, it's deflation.
Which is, it's a reflexive thing to say. Like,
right.
Inflation is the money supply increasing, and then they turn around and say, well, inflation increases the money supply. Well, yes, you just defined it as that.
Right. So then you end up being right by definition. But how is that useful to you in your investment decisions, specifically in your predictions for Federal Reserve policy, interest rates, stock market prices, corporate profits, etc.? How is that useful? It's actually, in my opinion, not very useful. So deflation can be the result, as Carol Quigley also notes, can be the result of an industrial boom and an output boom that pushes prices down very fast so that the aggregate price level comes down. But it could also be the outcome of a demand shock, which comes due to austerity, basically.
Right.
If the government imposes a tax and doesn't provide enough money to pay the tax and for people to save enough to feel comfortable with their future, then a sort of government-imposed austerity ensues, which is basically government depriving the private sector of the money it needs to be comfortable. The private sector will demand fewer goods and services. Businesses will sell less and lay off people. And then when people get laid off, they have even less money, and turns into this spiral until the problem of a lack of net private savings is resolved by the government, which is the only source of that said net private savings. If you
Right.
don't have an export surplus.
Right. And then, another thing that, you say that what I said about Austrians and libertarians regarding their theories on inflation might not be totally accurate. But I will say, in my anecdotal experience, and I used to be like this, talking to any Austrian or libertarian about economics is that they very quickly start hyperventilating about inflation. And
Yeah, right. Because what's bad? Like this is Tom Wood's argument. What's bad if my pair of jeans goes down from $50 to $25? Isn't that great? So doesn't everyone benefit?
Well, we're going to go into specifics why everyone doesn't benefit there. But the other argument is that inflation erodes savings, right? If you save up money, and I save up $100, and then the purchasing power gets cut in half. That means I only have $50, relatively speaking. And I mean that's true, but what if people haven't saved? I mean, what if there's no money to save? Right? That implies there's savings to be had, right? And if the money hasn't been created at the same level that the economy needs that money, or I guess we should say in more MMT terms, if the government hasn't issued enough private sector net savings where the private sector can save in aggregate, well then what savings is getting inflated here? And emphasis
Right.
in aggregate. I know this person or that person might have some savings, right? And the point that I'm trying to make here isn't that therefore inflation is good. I'm saying this is complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, and instead of just saying inflation bad or deflation good or something like that, let's get into the nuance and see what's going on here, because I know from, we'll call it the conspiracy theory angle, is that the inflation is a stealth tax. Because the people close to the money creation source get to print money out of nothing, spend it at today's value, and then everybody else who gets the money later gets it at the inflated value. Therefore, that's another reason why inflation is bad. But what E. Michael Jones is making the argument here for is that it's the other way around, because deflation benefits the creditor, right? If I lend you $100 today and tomorrow the dollar is worth twice as much, that means you got to work twice as hard to pay me that money back. Right? And so to what your example of what Tom Woods either said or you paraphrased him saying, if I got a pair of jeans that I had to spend $50 yesterday, but now I can spend $25 today, that's, I mean, who does that not benefit? It doesn't benefit the jean maker who bought everything and got loans to buy all those things. He bought inventory and all this stuff, and he paid wages, expecting that he was going to make $50 a pair. Tomorrow comes, he can only charge $25 a pair. Well, the loan that he got doesn't deflate.
It depends. It depends, because what if the jeans maker chose to outcompete his competitors and sells the jeans at a lower price? Because he's figured out, he's enhanced his productivity, he can produce so much more jeans, he can outcompete everyone.
Right. Well,
that is an example where, for the example I just gave is an example where deflation is not necessarily bad.
Good.
Yeah, but in many cases it comes out of demand, a lack of demand, which is induced by government austerity programs.
Right. To the point, the gold standard is essentially a government austerity program.
Yes.
Because it says, okay, we've got an economy, and particularly the United States, E. Michael Jones points this out here, we've got an economy that is relatively undeveloped and is getting produced quickly, right? This huge country that particularly has this huge natural resource and agricultural base where people are going out there where it's completely untapped and starting from zero. Well, this is a rapidly increasing population and a rapidly expanding economy. You need more money to deal with that. And so if you say, okay, let's constrict the money supply to make it sound by saying that it's gold, well, you've now disconnected the need of the society for currency from the ability to produce that currency, because you just said, okay, well, we're going to define it by what we're able to dig out of the ground, which isn't much in comparison to what we need it for. Right, and then you can say, well, that there was a multiplier effect, right? The fractional reserve where the banks are able to lend out, 10 times the amount of gold they had or whatever. But still, okay, well, it's 10 times the amount of gold, and that's the limit, right?
Yeah. Like I always say, it makes much more sense to look at the gold standard as a fiat money system where the government intervenes to fix the gold price. And to fix the gold price, what do you need to do? You need to buy and or sell gold at that price that you're fixing. So you need to have access to that gold. You need to have some kind of gold supply in order to be able to have gold to sell at that price.
Mm-hmm.
And that influences all your other decisions, your budgetary decisions, etc. I think it may also make sense, I don't know, because we jumped right into it, but we haven't really necessarily represented the other side of the argument, or even our side of the argument thoroughly. What is the idea behind the gold standard? Where does it come from? Why is that a thing that a certain strand of free market economists support? It goes back to their theory of money, which is the so-called barter theory of money, which says that in the beginning, we traded goods against goods. So I traded sheep for cows, and copper for silver, and chickens for shoes and whatnot. And over time, throughout this process of trading, the more fungible and more suitable more suitable goods emerged as media of exchange, and in the end, that ended up being gold and silver because of their properties, which are, it's true, they have certain properties that lend themselves to being a savings tool, in my opinion, actually. I mean, in my opinion and in my actions, because I do believe that gold is a good investment to have in your portfolio if you use it in the right way, if you use it in the right manner. If you look back at our episode 40 about the permanent portfolio,
we go over that specifically. I should say Nima goes over that specifically, and I just comment.
We go over why you need gold in your permanent portfolio and what it helps you with, which at what times it performs well, and when it doesn't, you have other assets in the portfolio that help you out there. But the barter theory of money, so continuing on that is the theory that basically then in today's world, today's free market economists, they think, well, we can, at the very least, we can go back to that free market state but that free market a system of using gold for exchange by linking our currency to gold. So we somehow create a system that at least has that original medium of exchange somewhere in there. And that way we restrain the government from doing all the terrible things that they do when they print too much money, etc., etc. Except that they actually don't, right? So that one purpose that it constrains the government, it doesn't ever seem to actually work out that way, because whenever they don't like it, they abandon it.
Which is when they go to war.
When they go to war, and when they just can't meet the gold demands anymore. Like in the United States, 1971 went off the gold standard. Was it 71 or 73?
I think it was 71.
I think 71. Because the French were accumulating a bunch of gold in their bank due to the Vietnam War. Germans were accumulating a bunch of gold for other reasons, I don't know. And they started doing the unimaginable, which is actually asking the US Federal Reserve to send them their gold. The system back then was actually a gold exchange standard. It wasn't even really gold standard. Inside the US, in fact, you weren't allowed to own gold. Not saying that the Austrian economists or the neoclassical free market economists who support the gold standard support that gold exchange standard. just to provide some more background detail on how far detached we've been for the longest time from the gold standard. Also, the Weimar Republic technically was on a gold
Yes.
standard, and how did that work out? Their hyperinflation because excuse me. I guess I got did I get the COVID? I don't know. The Weimar Republic. What was I saying?
Weimar Republic was on the gold standard, and
Was a gold
at least
standard.
our argument was that contributed significantly to the hyperinflation.
Well, I mean, ultimately, what caused the hyperinflation was the war debts that were impossible to pay off, had to be paid off in gold, so they had to scramble to get all the gold.
And they sold
on the markets.
Deutschmarks on the open
With
market.
Deutschmarks,
Yeah,
of
to
course.
accumulate the gold.
And the French marched in on the west, extracted all the German gold. Germany was basically destroyed from World War One, anyways. So it was all kinds of assaults on the country from all sides, and so then when you deprive the country of productive capacity, coal, and you use all your currency to buy gold on the market, so that's already inflationary. You have products supply collapsing. You have demand going up with the money printing, and then that's what caused the hyperinflation.
I want to add something that you mentioned earlier about the U.S. going off the International Gold Exchange because France and Germany were asking for the gold. When you have an international gold standard like that, or even a national gold standard, it becomes that easy for a foreign player to mess you up. Because they can just say, okay, well, we saved up a bunch of dollars, give us all that gold. And then we go, we need that. What do we do? Right? I mean, we were making fun of a guy, Neon Revolt is his social media handle, a couple months ago about suggesting that Russia was about to go on a gold standard, which was, I mean, we didn't have to debunk it. It was just dumb on its face. But we pointed out if Russia were to go on a gold standard, then you could any country could simply say, hey, I got a bunch of rubles. We'd like all that gold, please. And now Russia doesn't have any capacity to manage gold standard anymore, right? So it's basically, to go on a gold standard, it's taking the country's ability to manage its own currency and just like throwing it in the garbage for no reason.
Right. And the Austrian economists will say, well, the government shouldn't manage the economy. Okay, but now you have foreign governments managing your economy.
Right.
So is that any better? I think that you have to recognize the gradations between complete being a vassal to some other state, a ward of some other country, or at least maybe having some say in what your government does. Or maybe you don't even believe that. Well, then there's really no point in doing any of this. But in any case, the gold standard doesn't solve this problem.
Right, and then going back to what we were talking about in terms of the gold standard is supposed to restrain the government, and it never seems to do that, particularly when a war breaks out. I mean, going back to this book here, E. Michael Jones points out that when the Civil War broke out and Abraham Lincoln had to expand the money supply to pay for the war, he did so by borrowing $2.6 billion, which I'm not entirely sure who he borrowed it from. This must have been like a war bond promised to pay at some point in the future. And then he got, I guess, supposedly Congress's support to issue $500 million of just money that's just out there. These are the greenbacks, right? And E. Michael Jones, I'll quote him right here, this reckless expansion of the money supply brought about an inflation that was entirely predictable. Within 3 years of the war, prices rose by 74%. But then he turns around and says, okay, well, prices rose by 74%, but right after that, the economy was freaking booming. Now, I do have a problem first with
Sorry, when was this? When was this?
Civil War, 1864. Okay. Oh no, 1861. Excuse me, somewhere around there.
Yeah, wars are bad. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've got one thing to say about what his Dr. Jones' analysis, and then finish up the point that I started here, is that first of all, I don't like the issue of saying, okay, they printed the money, therefore things immediately inflated because of the money printing. Okay, that might be a contributing factor, but also keep in mind you've got a war going on.
Yeah. So,
Right? We've talked
yeah.
about this, is that military spending is by definition inflationary, right? Because you're spending a bunch of money. You're taking people out of the productive economy, sending them to go die, and sending them to destroy stuff, and creating things that aren't going back into the economy, right?
But and you're losing a bunch of young males, which are part of your labor force.
Exactly.
So you destroy the productive capacity of the economy. That's how you get an inflation for sure.
Right.
I wouldn't even, I don't even necessarily think the money printing itself would have had anything or that much to do with it.
Right.
But rather, it's rather like we saw in Weimar Germany, for example. It's actually a symptom of the prices shooting up so much that now all the services and goods that the government had to purchase have also gone up in price. So now they need to print more money to buy them. And there's actually research that has been done on that, where the timing of the printing versus the price increase is actually inverse to what a lot of people think today.
Right. And then to finish the point where we say, okay, does this constrain the government? Well, when it's a war, they just say, okay, forget that because we want to have a war. Well, and then the outcome of the war is terrible, but on the flip side, the economy actually improves. Where it's like, okay, do we have to have a war in order to improve the economy here? Can we learn the lesson that the economy can be improved without the war? I mean, this is like the irony of this chapter here is that the wars are showing that the gold standard is what's killing the economy. And then he to make matters worse, Michael Jones points out is that during the war, when all these government bonds are purchased to, in quotes, finance it, despite the fact that Lincoln showed that it could just be financed itself. This doesn't need to happen. But they still print these war bonds. The holders of the war bonds are therefore, after the war, incentivized to deflate the currency to pre-war levels because that means the money that the government is going to pay them is going to be worth more. So there again, the entire thing's set up to be the worst of all worlds, no matter which way you look at it. Because okay, we have the gold standard that puts us in artificial austerity. Okay, we're going to have a war and kill everybody, but the economy's going to do well. Okay, now that the war's over, stop the economy doing well, so the people holding the war bonds can make more money. And I mean, this boils down to the argument that he's making throughout the book is that usury is just the siphoning off of the surplus of labor without actually deserving it. And I think that this is a perfect example of what he's talking about.
Well, and this usury oftentimes is done by people who've been put in a privileged position by the state to create money. So it's not like an anti-free market view necessarily to be against usury, but it's rather putting constraints and limitations upon those that have been given the privilege by the state to be agents of the state, namely the so-called private banking system. I also wanted to, actually, I was just, we didn't talk about our theory of money, so maybe that would help to understand
let's do that. Go for it.
Where we're coming from. Because I just laid out the barter theory of money, which starts basically in an atomistic way from the individual trading with another individual, chickens for this, that, blah, blah, blah. Out comes the gold money system and silver money system. But in reality, if you look back at our, oh boy, what episodes? Where did we talk about this?
Previous episodes. Just look up episodes about money and MMT. Yeah.
With MMT and the history of money, the historical and archaeological, anthropological evidence rather shows that the money system has always been created by the state and imposed by the state. So the state demands a tax, and now people within under the purview of that state. Granted, this is a simplification, okay? It's complicated, but I think this is a good guideline.
This is the core of what's going on, and as we make it more complicated, it's all revolving around that core.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the state, let's say I want to occupy a territory, I impose a tax in Nima bucks, and the individuals in that region will ask me, well, why Why would I work for you? Sorry, no.
Why would I work for Nima bucks? What are these good for?
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, okay, let's start from this. Let's say I'm a general, I have an army, and I promise everyone if we occupy this territory, I will pay you all these Nima bucks. And they tell me, well, what are these Nima bucks worth? You just created them out of nothing. And then I say, well, I'm going to tax the population that we conquer in Nima bucks. They will need these Nima bucks to pay the tax to me. So you will be able to buy things from them because they need them. And if they don't pay, then I'll burn down their houses, or I'll put them in a cell, or whatever it is
Right.
that these lovely people in the government do. I mean, literally the Brits did this in Africa. Actually, it's even called the Hut tax. You can look it up if you can pull it up. The Hut tax. Okay, you're not pulling it up.
No, I'm pulling it. You just keep talking. Just keep talking.
I'm
I'm gonna send you the link.
Well, then I might as well do it myself.
I'm not set up to pull things up very easily on my end here. I'm saying that to the audience.
Why? We don't have anything special set up right now, do we? I mean, whether you pull it up or I pull it up.
Well, okay, let me pull it up and let's see what happens.
Yeah, I'm just curious. We're doing it live after all.
Okay, let's see. Share screen, and it's this one. Now, what does that show up over here? Oh yeah, it just freezes the video. It doesn't actually pull it up. If I pull it up, it just freezes the video.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. All this shit doesn't talk to itself very well.
Well, yeah, if we can figure that out, that'd
Yeah.
be great. So here's a hut tax. Hut tax was a form of taxation introduced by British in their African possessions on a per hut or other forms of household basis. It was variously payable in money, labor, grain, or stock. Because the reason being, the people in the occupied colonies weren't very interested in working for their British overlords.
Right.
And weren't really interested in working for this money thing that they were presenting. So then the Brits said, oh, okay, well then we'll burn down your house if you don't pay a tax in this money. How about now? Oh, okay, now we want to work for it. Yeah, I mean, I guess that sums it up.
I mean,
pretty
yeah,
well.
it's a property tax, and I think it's worth pointing out because we're so used to thinking about income tax, right? That income tax makes it a little weirder because you actually have to work in order to generate the liability for the tax, right?
Yeah, but actually it doesn't change the whole calculus at the end of the day. It's the same idea. There's money that a certain amount of people have to pay. In other words, the working population.
Right. Because there's still property taxes and sales taxes and blah, blah, blah.
And there's fees. So people say, well, not everyone. We get the stupidest arguments sometimes against this stuff. But yeah, not everyone has to pay the tax. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of people who need it. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of demand for this unit of exchange that has to be returned to the state, returned to Caesar, which is Caesar's actually.
Well, and I would argue everyone still needs to pay the tax because Bob Murphy, back in the day when I debated Bob Murphy, right, said, well, Dylan, when you were 12, I don't think you were filing a 1040 at the end of the year to pay your taxes. Well, it's like, yeah, well, when I go to the store, they charge me sales tax, and when they take that money, they got to turn around and fill out corporate tax documents, and the employees that get money have to fill out 1040s.
But also, because I don't understand how exactly a light bulb functions. Nobody uses light bulbs, right? Because nobody understands how they work. Really? Dude, come on.
I saw that. That was a double Vogel.
Doppelvogel, exactly.
Yeah.
So basically, and since so I have to pull up stuff. I was talking about the origins of the money story by
right. Yeah. So as opposed to the barter theory, there's this idea of credit and taxation being the source of money, not barter.
And that's in the book "Debt the First 5,000 Years" by David Graeber, which is may he rest in peace because he died recently, pretty young. And it talks about the origins of money. As far back as we can go, there's no evidence of barter as a system It's much rather some sort of communal money systems. Actually, tribal economies didn't really have an economy, really. I mean, they had more like
The chief told everybody who got what resource.
Yeah. So here
Yeah.
we store all the grain here, and here's who gets how much grain and all that.
Because I said so, and I'm the chief.
Right.
Or whatever
But then
the
because-
system is.
Right, but then also Zehan talks about this in his book because of international trade. Because in Mesopotamia, they didn't have anything. They didn't have everything that they had in the Indus Valley civilizations. Didn't have everything that they had in other parts of the world. So they needed to trade with each other, and they needed to have some sort of common standard. So through that, a money system emerges, and we can also go back to the first U.S. money. Actually, was also a fiat money that was given value because it was a payment for tax liabilities. I actually pulled that up also a little while ago. Colonial money, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Oh, so you're not. This isn't U.S. money. This is colonial money you're talking about, particularly Pennsylvania, correct?
Early U.S. money.
Yeah. No, Pennsylvania specifically did this, where they would issue their own token, demand it in a tax, and utilize that to pay for public projects. And
Exactly.
it appears to have worked great.
Right. So, because some people say, well, but in the U.S. we started with the gold standard. Not really. It was so. What we're trying to convey here is that the gold standard isn't this original gold money isn't this original clean pure system that existed at one point in time.
That things would be great if we just turned back to.
Right.
Yeah.
And then just the fiat money system came on top of that and screwed it all up. If you think that way, a lot of things won't really make a lot of sense in today's economy, in the past, the history, and future predictions.
And to that point,
try to
we've repeated this many times, is that when you look at the word fiat, it means decree. So that means if there's a gold standard, it's still fiat money because the government decreed that gold is the money. It's as completely arbitrary as pieces of paper or digital or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's something really important to understand. There's not this objective money that exists outside the realm of human society and human government, right? If
Right.
all humans vanished off the earth tomorrow, there would still be gold, but there wouldn't be any more money. Money is like a societal, human, legalistic creation. And the fact that it has been stamped on gold occasionally in the past doesn't change that. I have a next thing to move into, unless you had more on the points that we were already making.
Well, I'm just looking for that Wikipedia, but I guess I'll link it maybe later if I find it. I'll link it, but it's not really that important. But just I think the important point is that there's no real gold standard monetary system or no real gold monetary system that exists or has ever existed. Sometimes gold was used in Roman days for certain coins, but the coin value was based on the fact that it had a stamp of the emperor on it and that it was good for tax payments. And also the value of these coins, they circulated at a higher value than just the metal content.
And they had to, otherwise they'd get melted down.
Right.
And then actually to that point, I'm remembering this based off of reading The Lost Science of Money by Stephen Zarlinga of the American Monetary Institute, is that there was a coin at one point, I forgot if it was the silver ace or whatever it was. It was a silver coin that got printed that was worth 6 times its silver value, which completely blows the minds of the monetarists that researched that history, and they figured that it must be some sort of error. But he points out that the original Roman money, people don't realize this, was bronze. Yep. This is when they were small and inside their own zone. it was bronze, and when the Punic War started to happen, and Rome started really expanding more and more and more, they switched to a silver currency, but in two different ways. They had the local currency, which had a denomination stamped on it, for example, a 1. But then they had a currency that they gave to their soldiers out in the foreign areas that didn't have a denomination, because they knew that the legal value of the Roman money at home wouldn't have that legal value abroad. So basically, they were giving them silver for barter purposes abroad, because this can translate into whatever the local currency is. And Steven Zarlinga makes the argument, with which I agree, that this was the beginning of the downfall of the Roman economy, because now they were at the whim of international players messing with the gold and silver on the international scene. But to the point that Nima was making, there's significant evidence. I mean, again, the original bronze coinage of the Romans, the two different the international and the national coin, one had a denomination and one didn't, and the fact that there was this silver coin printed at one point that had 6 times the value of its silver content, is all pointing to the fact that even when gold and silver are being used as money, the evidence is showing that it's the legal value is the important part.
It's much more so. It's much rather a technology that's used to record debts and debt redemption values than the gold itself. Right? Today we have digital technology. It's important that when you have a monetary system, that it's not easy to counterfeit that money. Obviously, right? So in ancient days and in the past, we didn't have digital banking and all these things. So obviously they had to use some sort of metal that was rare or that only the state could obtain. The Roman state controlled all the mines, so they could easily get access to this metal. But to the individuals, it wasn't necessarily that easy. I mean, it wasn't a population that had a lot of things, right? So if they wanted to create a fake bronze coin, they would have to take something out of their household that's valuable to them and melt it down and create a fake gold coin.
Well, and then you'd have to have the technology to stamp an authentic looking coin.
Right.
Right?
If you get caught, then
death, crucifixion, torture. Yeah.
So here's just one more thing. Early American currency on Wikipedia. This is what I was looking for. It says here, one by one, colonies began to issue their own paper money to serve as a convenient medium of exchange. In 1690, the province of Massachusetts Bay created the first authorized paper money issued by any government in the Western world. This paper money was issued to pay for a military expedition during King William's War. Other colonies followed the example of Massachusetts Bay by using their own paper currency in subsequent military conflicts. However, as the colonies began printing their own money, location-based socioeconomic issues soon followed. Most of these concerns were rooted in each colony having different values of the dollar, which made any inter-colony transactions a confusing mess. By the time Parliament decided to prohibit the printing of paper money in the colonies, their hired counterfeiters were able to take advantage of the common people, widening the gaps between socioeconomic classes. The paper bills issued by the colonies were known as bills of credit. Bills of credit could not be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold or silver coins upon demand, but were redeemable at a time specified in the future. Bills of credit were usually issued by colonial governments to pay debts. The governments would then retire the currency by accepting the bills for payment of taxes.
Boom. Yep. Go ahead.
When colonial governments issued too many bills of credit or failed to tax them out of circulation, inflation resulted.
Did we write this in Wikipedia? This sounds exactly like us. Yeah.
But yeah, so I guess our main point is just the gold standard theory is a very theoretical theory, and the people who believe in it, they believe in it because they think they've come to this conclusion through some sort of what they call praxeological, logic-only, pure reason. It's almost like a form of rationalism.
Yes.
Going back to whatever philosophical conversations recently. because it's based on pure reason, it must be true. This is why they're so dogmatic about it. But then once you start looking at historical documents, then all you find is evidence for the opposite side of the story.
Well, and then I want to say some evidence right here. This is going back to E. Michael Jones. He's pretty critical of deflation. I mean, like you said, there could be some time. I mean, this is complicated, but he's pointing out that when you have a gold standard,
well, most of the time through history, it's been bad.
Yes.
So yeah.
Well, let's give an example of that right here. So he's basically saying what I just described before is if you pay a bunch of money as a outfit of some sort with a projection price to sell in the future, and everything deflates by the time you get there, it really screws you up. Here's an example. So a person who borrowed $1,000 to buy a farm in 1868 would not only have to grow I need to read something before here. The mechanics of deflation were simple, inexorable, and best of all, invisible to its victims. Did I say inflation or deflation? I meant whatever I said. I meant to say deflation. The mechanics of deflation were simple, inexorable, and best of all, invisible to its victims. During the last quarter of the 19th century, both population and production increased while the money supply was held constant. Doubling productivity while holding the money supply constant would cause the price of a bushel of wheat to be cut in half. And in addition, since money was now scarcer than before, interest rates would necessarily rise. And to an asterisk with that, I do think this is true in contrary to what we've said before, because there's no Federal Reserve System at this point.
Well, under a gold standard or something like it, yeah, it's true. Or if you have an international exchange standard,
yes,
then yeah, it's true.
To continue, the upshot of this policy was clear. This is getting back to what I started reading. A person who borrowed $1,000 to buy a farm in 1868 would not only have to grow twice as much wheat in 1888 to earn the same mortgage payment he made earlier, he would be repaying his loan in dollars that had twice as much purchasing power as the depreciated currency he had originally borrowed. Thus, while contraction was a blessing to the banker creditors, it placed a cruel and exploitative burden on the nation's producer debtors. Again, this, the Austrian view, and honestly, this is the neoclassical view, because this stems from Adam Smith, where you have this equilibrium that's always being sought within the economy, this invisible hand. It's bullshit. There's no such thing as this equilibrium. There's no such thing as this invisible hand. So this idea that, okay, when the value of a currency deflates, the whole ocean's gonna go down at the same time, and everything's gonna deflate in equilibrium at the same time. It doesn't, right? And he goes on to say that where was it? That basically gold can never keep pace with human productivity, and he claims that the gold standard is synonymous with usury, but just as human productivity cannot keep up with the compound interest of usury, the money supply, if it's based on gold, can't keep up with human productivity. So inevitably, we get in the situation where the farmer lacks liquidity to get himself through the season.
Yeah, and that illustrates another point, which is that this constant battle in the economies throughout history between these three classes: banking, industry, and agriculture. Mm-hmm. Right? Agriculture hates deflation and has no problem with inflation, really, because they're the first to sell all the goods that inflate in price when inflation happens. Industry also doesn't really have a problem with inflation. Bankers, they have a big problem with inflation because they have made loans at a fixed rate, and they want to preserve the value of the money that they're banking on for the next decades or more. So they are more into deflation, and everything else be damned, basically. I mean, that's just the natural incentives that these different players have in the system. And Carol Quigley also writes about, actually, I found the section where he talks about this a little bit as well, if you want me to.
I do, but let me finish this point from Dr. E. Michael Jones, because he wraps it up in this sentence. As a result, the farmer, and this is exactly what you just said, or the other side of what you just said. As a result, the farmer was forced to borrow more and more just in order to survive. But in an age of deflation, this meant that the money borrowed at higher and higher interest rates had to be packed with money earned more and more laboriously. Right? This again, we're looking at what's the real source of what's going on here. The real source of value. It's the labor. More and more labor is having to be applied to deal with this deflation, because lower and lower commodity. They had to work more laboriously because of lower and lower commodity prices. As a result, the farmer found it impossible to keep up and often lost his farm to creditors. I mean, how many times have we seen that play out?
Yeah, that's what deflation puts people in a bind, and they have to sell things, and then who ends up snapping that all up? It's the bankers.
Right.
Quigley
Give us some
writes,
Quigley.
Quigley writes here in Tragedy and Hope, page 57. Throughout modern history, the influence of the gold standard has been deflationary, because the natural output of gold each year, except in extraordinary times, has not kept pace with the increase in output of goods. Only new supplies of gold, or the suspension of the gold standard in wartime, or the development of new kinds of money, like notes and checks, which economize the use of gold, have saved our civilization from steady price deflation over the last couple of centuries. As it was, we had two long periods of such deflation we had two such periods of deflation from 1818 to 1850 and from 1872 to about 1897. The three surrounding periods of inflation, 1790 through 1870, 1850 through 1872, 1897 through 1921, were caused by, number one, the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon, when most countries were not on gold. Number two, the new gold strikes of California and Alaska in 1949-1950, followed by a series of wars which included the Crimean War of 1954 through 1956, the Austrian-French War of 1859, the American Civil War of 1861 through 1865, the Austro-Prussian and Franco-Prussian Wars of 1866 and 1870, and even the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. And number three, the Klondike and Transvaal gold strikes of the late 1890s, supplemented by the new cyanide method of refining gold, about 1897, and the series of wars from the Spanish-American War of 1898 through 1899, the Boer War of 1899 through 1902, and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through 1905, to the almost uninterrupted series of wars in the decade from 1911 through 1921. In each case, the three great periods of war ended with an extreme deflationary crisis, 1890, 1873, 1921, as the influential money power persuaded governments to re-establish a deflationary money unit.
Exactly what Dr. Jones just said here.
Exactly.
Yep.
With a high gold content. The obsession of the money power with with deflation was partly a result of their concern with money rather than with goods, but was also founded on other factors, one of which was paradoxical. The paradox arose from the fact that the basic economic conditions of the 19th century were deflationary, with a money system based on gold and an industrial system pouring out increasing supplies of goods. But in spite of falling prices, with its increasing value of money, the interest rate tended to fall rather than to rise. This occurred because the relative limiting of the supply of money in business was not reflected in the world of finance, where excess profits of finance made excess funds available for lending. Moreover, the old traditions of merchant banking continued to prevail in financial capitalism even to its end in 1931. It continued to emphasize bonds rather than equity security stocks, to favor government issues rather than private offerings, and to look to foreign rather than to domestic investments. Until 1825, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities of the London Stock Exchange. I mean, that's something we've talked about also. The stock market hasn't always been this important thing, right? Until 1925, government bonds made up almost the whole of securities of the London Stock Exchange. In 1843, such bonds, usually foreign, were 80% of the securities registered. In 1875, they were still 68%. The funds available for such loans were so great that there were, in the 19th century, sometimes riots by subscribers seeking opportunities to buy security flotations, and offerings from many remote places and obscure activities commanded a ready sale. The excess of savings led to a fall in the price necessary to hire money, so that the interest rate on British government bonds fell from 4% to 3, blah, 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 blah.
Getting granular in his detail there.
Yeah. All this served to strengthen the merchant bankers' obsession both with government influence and with deflation, which would increase value of money and interest rates.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
and then I'm curious. Can you pull up your chart from your old website of when the federal budget surpluses occurred? I want to know if one happened right before 1873.
Do I have a chart? I think I saw an article on that. I don't know.
Oh, well, it was either a chart it's in an article.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
remember if
yeah.
it was in paragraph form or chart
It's
form.
a quote from Randy Ray's Modern Money Theory. But okay, I know how to look for it because the search function on my old website is crap.
So while he's searching for that, I just want to explain what we're looking for is that we haven't talked about it today, but in our previous MMT shows we pointed out that the fundamental causes of crashes. Now, I mean, there's all sorts of other stuff that goes on, but like the fundamental core issue is if the government is taxing more than it's spending, because that means it's taking more money out of the system than it's putting in. And then when that happens, in order for the private sector to continue having any sort of liquidity to continue its economy and continue production, it starts going into debt to itself, and at some point it's not able to finance its own debt. It can't service its own debt, and the whole thing collapses. And that can be avoided simply by the federal government making sure there's enough debt-free money. Again, we explain why in other shows, why the government printing money is debt-free. Debt-free money in the system to support the private sector debt servicing that's needed by the private sector doing loans. And so this has happened 6-7 times in history, in U.S. history, and each time there was a crash right afterward. And I'm seeing if 1873 was one of those times. You got it pulled up yet?
I don't understand why it's so hidden. I'm trying to find it on Google with the right keywords. And
Nima unable to look at his own website. He's looking at economicsjunkie.com. This is I mean, it's still there, but I don't think you're actively putting anything on there anymore, are you?
No.
Yeah.
And the search function, I haven't really spent time on fixing it, unfortunately. Boy, where's that?
Man, do I need to go there and we have a race? Economicsjunkie.com. If I can spell economics right. Let's see.
What did I have in that article?
I think it was on one of your Mind Being Libertarian, beinglibertarian.com articles.
Well, that was a different article. I think this was a pretty short one where I just quote from that book. Depressions. Wow. Okay, I think I might have it somewhere. Oh yeah.
Found it? Okay, great.
That was fun. Yeah, it's right here, 1873.
So the what exactly happened prior to 1873 from the federal? Let's see. The national debt fell by 59% from 1867 to 1873. This is exactly the time frames that Dr. Jones just gave here.
Yeah,
right after the Civil War.
From 1867 to 73, it fell by 27%.
Oh,
the 59% is regarding the 1857. But yeah.
Got it.
So this is responsible fiscal policy.
In quotes. Nima's doing air quotes over there. You can't see him.
This is the results of responsible fiscal policy. Every time we do it, there's a depression afterwards. So
Right. And
right.
to that point, I want to emphasize this because I'm sure some people would be thinking, "Oh my God, what about the Federal Reserve causing 1929?" Well, there was a let's see, from 1920 to 1930, about a third of the national was the national debt reduction.
Yeah.
That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah, the national debt was reduced by about a third from 1920
Yeah.
to 1930. So. No, it wasn't the Federal Reserve. I'm sure the Federal Reserve had something
And
to
this
do
is
with the
like-
machinations of it, but that wasn't the cause of the problem.
Yeah, this would every budget hawk's dream would be like, because nowadays that doesn't happen anymore. It's also why depressions don't really happen nowadays, I think. But back then, the national debt was literally cut by a third. Today, that would mean, because our national debt is like what 30 trillion or whatever, it would be the 10 trillion budget surplus by the federal government would be required to make that happen. And it would also probably cause a depression, just as all these other times this has happened. Anytime during balanced, if you assume balanced trade, for the sake of the argument, anytime you run a budget surplus, you will deprive your private sector of net private savings, which is fully in line with our theory of money and recessions and business cycles and depressions. And the evidence of reality appears to back that up as well.
Well, and also this is interesting. I'm looking at Dr. Jones' book here. So he puts the Depression at 1873 as a result of what's called the the Fourth Coinage Act of 1873, which is the thing that declared the gold standard. And based on what we know, I would argue that the national debt reduction was the thing that was the fundamental foundation of what caused it. And then something like this, the Fourth Coinage Act of 1873, was probably the catalyst that finally knocked it over the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a short chapter, but I think it pretty well elucidates why, the gold standard's bunk, and why, when we're talking about economic issues, you can't just basically look at stuff and say, inflation good, or excuse me, inflation bad, deflation good, or something like that. Like these things are really, really complicated, and there's a lot of players where, like you said, okay, agriculture benefits from this, the banks benefit from that, and manufacturing benefits from this, and they're contradictory. And then we say, okay, well, who's in charge? Oh, the banking class. That's why they always get what they want. And then maybe as a society, we go, okay, what's more important to us, that banks get their interest or that we produce food? Right? So who's getting served here? And we're not able to actually address these issues if we don't understand how the goddamn system works.
Right.
Yeah.
If ideology gets in the way, especially.
Yeah.
And also for personal money management purposes, that's why I talk about the permanent portfolio in episode 40, where there's ways for you to protect yourself against inflation. But it doesn't mean you have to put all your money in gold, because that's a very bad investment decision in the long term.
Well, we can use Peter's Schiff to prove that. Sorry, peanut gallery over here.
But if you diversify well, then you can benefit from the different trends in their respective periods accordingly. And gold plays a role in it. Gold does well when the real interest rate is low, specifically. What is real interest rate? Real interest rate is nominal interest rates minus inflation.
Oh God, I'm trying to remember what all this stuff is again. I remember going over this in the permanent portfolio show. Nominal interest rates minus inflation. Okay, right. Okay, I remember.
I mean, basically your money in your bank account doesn't really pay anything. That's always good for gold.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also times of high inflation when interest rates go up almost in lockstep.
Which is, I want to make a point emphasize a point that Nima's making here. That means your bank account, your savings account interest rate goes up.
Yeah.
As well.
So then,
yes.
Now you get compensated for this supposed inflationary savings loss, and you earn compound interest, over time. So to say that inflation always erodes savings is not true, because there's ways, even with the simplest forms of savings, like a bank account. Not saying that it fully, like right now we have 9%. I don't know. It's coming down. I think the inflation rate. The worst we saw was, I think, as much as 9% or so. So the interest rate on a bank account is maybe, or on a treasury bill. I actually always recommend treasury bills because they always pay the best interest rate when it comes to investing your cash.
In a stable something, right?
Yeah, when it comes to, so the permanent portfolio consists of 4 categories: stocks, bonds, gold, and cash. And the cash you put into treasury bills that renew every year. And the rates on that right now are like 4.5% or something like that.
Which ain't bad for a treasury bill.
Right, which ain't bad for a guaranteed near cash-like investment. And is it perfect? Well, sometimes the inflation is higher than that. The inflation data is also a whole question in and of itself. It's kind of like global warming. Is there such a thing as global warming? What is global warming? The competent geologist, physicist, and in fact the Nobel Prize winner in physics, Norwegian guy, he said that he talks about what utter horse shit this is to suggest that there's such a thing as a global temperature.
Right. I mean, it's really big and really complicated, and there's different pieces that you can't look at this and say, well, okay, here's one number that describes the whole thing.
Right. And I'm detecting this trend with the globalist bullshit artists out there. They constantly try to invent these numbers and these metrics that they put in front of the gullible public's stupid faces as if it means something.
Your score went up by 3. Oh, no, it went down by 5. Yeah, something like that.
Well, your score, that's at least individualist. That's
the planet score. There we go.
Yeah, the global temperature went up by 1% over the past 20 years, past 100 years, or 1.5% over the past 100 years. What does this mean? For you sitting there right now in your part of the world, on your continent, in your city, in your apartment, what does this mean that the global temperature has gone up by 1%? It's a meaningless number that's manufactured to invent excuses for policy. It's the same with the so-called COVID pandemic. It's like, this is the 7-day incident rate right now, and the PCR tests have produced so many positives. That's why I said COVID.
I just want to be careful. Just being careful. COVID, please continue. The picker tests.
The picker tests that are meaningless have delivered some number that you have to get excited and scared about, because here we tell you it's important and it's bad. And inflation is kind of in that category. I put that in kind of that category as well, because inflation is put together out of a basket of so many different goods and services that it's not necessarily always, that number is not necessarily always meaningful. And then, not saying that there hasn't been a big inflation over the past 2 or 3 years or so. Of course not. We actually predicted that, because MMT tells you the deficits are large. And if then on top of that the oil price shoots up because of a dumb war, and if you muck up the supply chain, if you shit all over your economy by locking everything down like a bunch of psychopaths, then you're gonna cause some inflation by doing these things.
But that's not due to, I think, to that point. When we talk about inflation, the money supply is not the only thing to calculate inflation with, right? And in fact, we're making the argument that's one of the weaker things, and that there's more fundamental things like, paying everybody to stay home, so that destroys your productive capacity, or destroying the distribution chains around the world, and starting a war, and now the price of oil went up, and Russia invaded the Ukraine, now there's all these sanctions, and then the distribution chains are even more fucked up, and all this sort of stuff increases prices, and if you add money on top of it,
But that's just by the way. But my point just now that I wanted to sort of make is that all these numbers, these aggregate numbers that are put in front of you, you have to be very skeptical and careful, and you have to look at what's behind those numbers. How are they produced? What are the factors? What are the inputs? What are the methodologies? Who suggested that methodology, and why? And what motivations do they have? Once again, we go back to the whole problem with the ideology of scientism, and instrumentalism, where you forget about all the imperfections along the way.
Nima's bringing it all together. Keep going. No, this is good. Keep going.
Where you basically eliminate from your thinking all the different layers of imperfection that compound on top of one another to produce some number at the end of the day that is not really as meaningful as you think it is. And even an individual PCR test itself is not that meaningful necessarily, right? Because as the inventor of PCR said, you can find something of everything if you magnify the observed sample enough. If you go beyond a certain number, you'll always get a positive test.
Well, and
different PCR tests have different cycle thresholds in different parts of the world, in different states in the U.S. even some. We don't even know necessarily what the cycle. I mean, there's so much that's unknown. It's stunning to me that people take these numbers and regurgitate them as though they were saying something meaningful.
Yeah, well, and then I want to put that into something a little bit more understandable, because what the PCR test does, and I mean, we're getting kind of sidetracked here, but Nima's making a really important point that does apply to what we've been talking about the whole time, is if you look at something like the PCR test, what it does is it finds something in your body and starts to duplicate it, right? Times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2, times 2, and it duplicates it until there's enough of it there that the test can actually identify it. Right? So, for example, or I should lead up to this, Nima's saying this, and this is what the founder, or the guy who invented the PCR test said, is that just because you found a thing in somebody's body doesn't mean that thing is doing this, that, or the other thing. For example, instead of talking about viruses, let's talk about a chemical. Let's say benzene. Benzene is a very, very toxic and carcinogenous chemical, right? Let's say someone did a PCR test on me for benzene. Is it within the possibility that somewhere in my body there's a molecule of benzene? Yeah, I mean, maybe I smelled some gas this morning and it's in there, right? So this PCR test picks up benzene. We do times 2 to the power of 50, and the doctor comes back and says, "Whoa, you have benzene poisoning." Like, no, you just happen to find a molecule of benzene in me, right? So, again, to Nima's point is that, we've got these really big generalized numbers that are so divorced from, or reality. I should say there's so many layers in between what the interpretation is versus the empirical test that was done, that you become divorced from reality. And then that number becomes meaningless, and now we're all emotionally chasing this number like, look at the shiny thing, look at the shiny thing, look at the shiny thing. Yes.
Yeah, R naught. Like Peter Zehan, too, he talks about R naught, the R naught rate in China, this and that. What does this mean? It's based on a Scientology test, you moron. Do we do this? Do we report on the Thetan level tests of Scientologists around the world every day and panic over that?
The Scientologists would have us, yes.
Yeah, they would. They would. And at this point, honestly, who's to say that they won't one day, that they won't get into that kind of position of power? Because we've seen the exact same bullshit works on a lot of people in the world.
Yeah.
Not so much in the US, maybe. anymore. I think people have woken up to some extent, but it's not. That's not
Go over to
necessarily
Europe and see what's going on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to wrap this up, what you're pointing out, Nima, is that okay? We look at this inflation number, and it's because, like you said, there's so many layers factored into what the hell's going on with this number that it kind of sort of becomes meaningless. And particularly when you go, when we take into account all the things that we just went over, I mean, from this book, from our MMT knowledge, from Carol Quigley, from everything else, that, okay, inflation on its own, just the concept is very complicated, and whether it's good or bad, depending on the situation, it's really, really complicated. And then to take that and just say, okay, inflation bad, and then, okay, we're going to calculate it in this way that 100% is accurate and makes sense, and here's a number, it's nuts.
Right. So the idea, like, you have all these different disparate factors weighed at a certain level based on someone's opinion on how they should be weighed. And now you're making Federal Reserve policy based on that number in order to produce a better number, even though the Federal Reserve policy has no effect on that number. And there's no evidence that it has any such effect. Nobody's produced a correlation. In fact, Professor Werner talks about this too, and what he found out, it's consistent with our analysis, is that whenever the inflation goes up, the Fed raises the interest rates after the inflation goes up.
Right.
When inflation goes down, the Fed drops the interest rates after the inflation has gone down. That's the best we can tell. There's no correlation between the two.
Well,
in fact, if there is a correlation, there's actually a better correlation to suggest that the opposite happens, that when rates are high, inflation is high. When rates are low, inflation is low.
Absolutely. So I think this is an excellent point to wrap it up. My wife and child just showed up into the studio, so I'm going to keep them here and want to say hi. And I please give us some comments on this, because I mean, we love this stuff. We think it's super duper important. Feel free to pick fights for us on other shows. If you think it'd be fun for us to go toe to toe talking about economics on this, you're more than welcome to pick economic fights for for us.
Also, if you could share, and
subscribe.
Spread this with other people. We're not charging you any money for this, and we put a lot of effort into producing these things. So we could really use a little more push and a little more support in the social medias for our content in order to make sure that we have a bigger community to have this dialogue with.
Absolutely. So this has been Dylan Moore and Nima Majur of Irida TV. Go over to irida.tv to find that social media that Nima has so humbly asked you to push. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.